Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live on Whytedavy Gardening and Worm Farm. I apologize to those who were here and had to leave because I was having technical difficulties, so I had to switch laptops. So today we're going to be talking about worm farming, and feel free to ask questions, whatever questions you like, and I'll be asking a few questions of my own. Just a minute. Hi, Han White. Hi, Cian. Hi, Marcia. Okay, so we're gonna start off with, hi, Healthy Home. Healthy Home, if you don't mind me asking, what is your name? Okay, so the first question that I want to ask is, do you have a worm farm? Yes, I have. In a bin. Okay. And how do you start a worm farm? Because this is a question that a lot of persons are concerned about. How do they start a worm farm? I don't mind. My name is Khadija. I pronounced that right? Okay, good, Khadija. Okay, very nice name. I like it. Okay. Yeah, we have quite a lot of Khadijas in Jamaica. During the time that I was born and shortly after my time period, it seems a lot of people find this name to be quite nice. So a lot of girls there a bit younger than me are in my age group are named Khadija. Yeah, so how do you start a worm farm? This is a question that a lot of people ask. And so today I'm going to be sharing how to start a worm farm, but uh, if you already have a worm farm, it means you already know how to start a worm farm. If you want to answer the questions that I'm asking before I explain or during the time that I am explaining, then feel free to do so. So starting a worm farm is not difficult. In fact, it is very easy. It does not require much. Uh, you need a bin for your worm, and you need bedding and food scraps. In most cases, it would be best to have a cover for your bin, and you might need something, a drill or something that you can use to put holes in your worm bin. My mom doesn't like that. It is more popular now than before. Okay. Well, I just started a compost bin, which turned into a worm bin. Nice. I remember you telling that story. Yeah, that's how it is with names. Once somebody hear a name and it is nice, then they say, "Oh, I can name my kid that." So there's no escaping it. No worm farm. Trying composting. Okay, I enjoy composting as well. In fact, that is the means that I use to feed my worms because I don't mind feeding them food scraps, but because I have problem with mice, especially in the winter, wherever they are, they seem to find my food scraps in the winter. So because of that, I try not to feed my worms food scraps, but compost. Anyway, that was a question I was going to be discussing. Back to how to start a worm bin. So I mentioned the things that you're going to need, and a drill or whatever you can use to bore holes in your worm bin. Now, if you're going to be putting holes in your worm bin, and mark you don't have to. It is not necessary to have holes in your worm bin, but if you're not going to have holes, then you have to be very careful of the moisture content that is going to be in your bin. And you also have to control what you feed your worm if you're not putting holes in your bin. If you're putting holes in your bin, you're going to need to put holes in the bottom of the bin to allow. Hi, Virginia Food Grower. Welcome to my live. Yeah, so as I was saying, if you're going to put holes in your bin, you want to put holes in the bottom of your bin to drain excess water. That is one of the purpose of the holes. And also to allow airflow in your bin. So on the side of your bins at the top, close to the top, you want to have holes as well. This is where the main air supply is going to come from. If you have your bin covered, you can also put holes in the top of your bins. But I would recommend that for the holes that you're putting in your bin, nothing greater than 1/4 inch. And the reason I say make it 1/4 inch is because rodents can get into your bin if you have a 3/8 of a inch holes in your bin. So you want to keep the holes 1/4 inch or less, not more. But I don't recommend going less than 1/4 inch because sometimes your castings can clog the hole and make it more difficult for you to have proper drainage. So if you're putting holes at the bottom, make sure it is 1/4 inch. Then you're going to need bedding for your worms. Now, what is it that you can use as bedding? There are many things that can be used. The cheapest things that you can find for bedding, depending on your location, well, not necessarily depending on your location, are cardboards and newspaper shredded. These are cheap. You can find them around your home. Depending on where you are, like if you're in the tropics and areas like that, you might have access to coconut trees, and thus you might have access to the coconut coir. This is good as bedding in your worm farm as well. And peat moss can also be used as bedding. I see some people put soil in their worm bin, but I don't use soil in my worm bin. You can also use compost as your bedding. You can use dried leaves as your bedding as well. So that is it on bedding. Now what you're going to need is your worms. I don't know, you might be able to get worms from local suppliers, or you might have to buy your worms online. Some people are fortunate enough where they can get worms in their backyards. Now mark you don't want to use regular earthworms. These are not composting worms. Yes, they will eat your food scraps, but they are not good composting worms. One, they require a lot of space, and they don't reproduce very fast, not as fast as the composting worms. They don't live in their food supply, they live in the soil. So for that reason, they are not good composting worms, and they're bottom feeders. And the amount of moisture that your composting worms can withstand, the regular earthworms cannot withstand that amount of moisture. They're very delicate. These worms live deep in the soil, and then they come up and feed and go back down into the soil. Whereas composting worms tend to feed on the surface, especially the red wigglers. The other worms might feed all over the bin, but red wigglers are mostly top feeders. Okay, I've been talking for a while and I have not been looking to see if there are any questions. My apologies. Okay, let's see. It might turn into a worm bin, her healthy home. Okay. I'm at work, so just a quick stop by to send a greeting. Oh, that's pretty kind of you. Got an alarm going off there. Okay, so let's see what else I've missed. Where would you put the bedding? Okay, the bedding, I'm discussing the materials that you will need. The bedding is the first thing that you're going to put into your worm bin. So that is where it goes, on the bottom of your worm bin. Now, I mentioned that you're going to need a worm bin. Your worm bin can be one part or two parts. So, for example, say you're using a tote as your worm bin. If you're going to be putting holes in your worm bin, and your bins are going to be indoors or somewhere where you don't want the moisture to flow freely, then you're going to need two of those containers. One is going to go into the other. So the one that you're going to be putting the worms in with the holes, that is going to go into the other bin. The other bin is not supposed to have any holes in the bottom, because that bin will be your catchment tray. I used to compost when I just started out. Okay. What do you mean by bottom feeders? Okay, bottom feeders mean that the worms feed at the bottom of your bin. They don't feed on the surface. Red wigglers, however, like to feed on the surface, but if they have a lot of food supply, they will stay wherever the food supply is. And because red wigglers are surface feeders, that is why a lot of people will allow the worms put a small amount of food scraps on top of their bedding. The worms will live in that area. They will lay their eggs in the bedding. They will eat the food scraps, and then that, along with the bedding, they're going to eat. And then that will produce castings. And then you feed on top of that. So once the bedding and the food scraps become vermicompost or castings, then you feed on top of that, so you don't disturb the material at the bottom. That is good, because it allows you to be able to harvest your castings without disturbing your worms. You just scrape off the worms and the food scraps off the top, and then you just take the finished castings out, because the worms will gradually move upwards. Right, the worms will gradually move upwards as they feed. So that is a good way to run your bin if you want to be able to harvest your casting without having to do much. Mhm. Oh, no worries, our healthy home. We know what it is like to be busy. I'm grateful that you could join us, though. Okay. Uh, Thank you, her healthy home. Okay, do you have any catchment trays? Switch on your light. You can't see my light is on. I don't know. No, that will make it worse. This location is not pretty good. Um, I don't know what to do. My light is on, but the problem I'm having is the light is that way in front of me somewhat, but I am not able to switch my location because my husband is home today, so I can't use my bedroom for my live. And my daughter is occupying the other room for her schooling, so I can't do that. I can't go there either. And then my son is in the living room sleeping. He got up early with his sister, and then he went in the living room to sleep. So I'm stuck in this location. I apologize for that. Uh, Let me see if I can This might be a bit noisy. I'm going to see if I can move my table forward so I'm a bit more under the light. No, that doesn't make it any better. Okay, I think that is a little bit better. I think maybe because the light is there at the window, so it makes it a bit dark. Okay, now I have to move my things over. Okay. Do you have a catchment tray? For my Canadian nightcrawler, I do have a catchment tray because that bin has holes in the bottom. For the other trays or worm bins, they don't have holes, so there is no catchment trays for those. If your worm bin is going to be outside on a stand or on the ground, stuff like that, then you don't necessarily need a catchment tray. It is mostly if you're going to be keeping your worm bin in your garage where you don't want the liquid draining on the floor or in your house, then you definitely have to have a catchment tray. I didn't ask that. Do you have to have a catchment tray? Oh, my apologies. Well, I guess I covered that, eh? You only need a catchment tray. There are two reasons why you may need a catchment tray. If you, as I mentioned before, if you don't want the liquid running out on your floor, if your bin is indoors, whether in your garage or your shed or your house, then you need a catchment tray. If your bin is outside where it doesn't matter where the liquid goes, then you don't need one. If, however, you want to use the leachette that runs out of the worm bin, then you will need a catchment tray so that you can use the leachette. And leachette is not the same thing as worm tea. A lot of times people will interchange these words. They're not the same thing. Leachette is just the water or the liquid that runs off or out of your worm bin. Yes. So leachette is just the liquid that runs out of your worm bin. Hi, pit stop, Tina, right? Yeah, so leachette is just that liquid that runs out of your worm bin. So whether it is the drainage from the food scraps as it breaks down, or it is the water that you had to your worms and then the excess just runs out, that is what you call what is called leachette. Now, it does have a bit of nutrients in it, but it does not have a lot. Hi, Gail, how are you? Right, so that is what leachette is. It does not have a concentrated amount of nutrients in it. Now, worm tea, on the other hand, that is different because that is where the finished castings is soaked in liquid in water for a period of time. Some people might soak it for maybe a few hours. It's best to soak it for 24 hours because then you get the most out of it. And if you want to get the best out of your worm tea, then what you need to do is to aerate it. You have two options. You can either put a pump in that container with your water and the worm castings and allow the pump to circulate the liquid, and then that is going to increase the air supply in the worm tea, and that air supply is going to help to increase the microbial action in your worm tea. So that is the best way to make your worm tea. However, if you don't have a pump to do that, you can occasionally go and stir it by hand, and that will help to increase the microbial action as well. Or you can just simply soak it in the water for 24 hours and then you use it. So worm tea and leachate, not the same thing, and they should not be used interchangeably, because the leachate, while it has a bit of nutrients, it does not do much. It is just good for watering your plants, really. Whereas the worm tea will supply your plants with a lot of nutrients. And one of the benefits of the worm tea also, sometimes you might want the nutrients for your plants, but you don't want to add the bulky stuff to your garden. So say, for example, you're starting seedlings, or you are watering things that are in pots, then you don't want to add bulky material to it, because you might not have the space in your pots or in your seedling tray to add things like compost or castings. So what you want to do then is create the worm tea and use that to water your plants. So your plants get the nutrients, they get the water, but you don't have any buildup of material in your garden. Okay, I'm not missing anything. I don't know if I'm missing anyone, but if I am, I apologize. Okay, next question. What do you feed your worms? For me, it is mostly castings. Occasionally, I will feed them a bit of food scraps just to let them enjoy something different. Uh, and the reason that I use castings as opposed to food scrap, as I mentioned before, is to control rodents and insects like flies in the worm bin. Of course, you can take care of the flies by covering your worm bin with the screen that you use on your window, or you can use a cloth as well. You can use a cloth and cover it over with the cover of your worm bin. Okay, so on white says food scraps all the way and paper. Yes, most people feed their worm bins food scraps. I see sometimes people will mention that they feed the worms cornmeal or oats or other products that they have to buy. No, I am very frugal. Even if I have the money, I don't think I should have to spend money to buy food to feed my worms when there are so many organic things around me. Besides, feeding them the stuff that are around me give me an opportunity to recycle what is there, rather than using up material that other people who don't have the organic matter around them could have. So yes, food scraps, I think, is better for your worms in terms of the fact that it has a lot of liquid in it, so you don't have to moisten your bin, and the worms love it. Hi, Chanel. Thank you for joining me. Yes, so food scraps is ideal in that sense because it provides a lot of nutrients for, not nutrients, a liquid, lot of liquid in the bin, so you don't necessarily have to water your bin, so you can save resources. Who said I wanted to walk up? You made a mistake. Okay, yes, to wake up already. Did I wake you? I'm sorry. Anyway, you need to get up. You've got things to do. Okay. Yes. I like the compost to feed my worms also because it is convenient. I don't necessarily have to add bedding to my material. I don't have to add bedding to my material because the compost serve as bedding for them as well. The only thing is that sometimes it can become a bit compacted, but not too bad. So yes. Okay, next question. What insects do you have in your worm bin? Do you have a lot of different insects in your worm bin? Um, at times, yes. Sometimes I see fruit flies in my bin. That is the most common ones, but in recent times, because I switched over to casting to compost, then I haven't seen much of those. Um, Hair wigs, those are some little elongated creatures with a pincher on their backs. These can be in your worm bin, but most of the insects that you see in your worm bin, people might be afraid that they are harmful to the worms. In most cases, they are not. The only time you need to worry about the insects that are in your worm bin, flies, because of you know what flies represents, and because of their rate of reproduction, and you don't want to have flies around, then those you don't want, you're going to try to get rid of as quickly as possible. Is it a bad thing to have insects in your worm bin? No, it's not a bad thing to have. In fact, some of these insects that are in your worm bin, they are actually composters as well. Some of them have a symbiotic relationship with your worms. So you don't have to worry about insects in your worm bin. If, however, you have red mites in your bin, they are not harmful to your worms, but you don't necessarily want them in there, because when their population increases, what you're going to find is that your worms will tend to stay at the bottom of the bin and not come up, because they want to stay away from the red mites. The white mites, these work well with your composting worms. They're not a problem. Um, there are so many different insects that you can have in your worm bin. However, if you see centipedes in your worm bin, you need to try to get rid of them as quickly as possible. They can pinch your worms, and they're harmful to your worms. You don't want them in your worm bin. Not to mention, they can pinch you too if you have your hands in your bin. So if you have centipedes, millipedes are fine in your worm bin. I don't like them though. Thank God I don't have millipedes here. At least I've never seen any. I do have centipedes in my bin occasionally, especially because I am feeding my worms finished compost, and they like to go in my compost bin outside. Okay. Okay, I didn't know that. That's great. Okay. All right. Now, so insects in your worm bin on a whole is not bad. You don't want a large increase of certain things, certain insect in your worm bin, because they may compete with your worms for food. That is the biggest problem that you may have with having a lot of insects in your worm bin. Okay, so another problem that we may have in our worm bin is potworms. What are potworms? Potworms are some tiny little white worms that look like thread. The sad thing is that potworms look a lot like your hatchlings. So it is not so easy to identify them. Now, how can you get rid of potworms in your bin? If, let's see what Han White says here. Which is best to feed your worms? Finished compost or food scraps? That is a very good question. I was doing a research on that, an experiment on that last year, early last year. Yeah. But unfortunately, shortly after I started the experiment, the worms, for whatever reason, I still haven't figured out yet, those worms died, most of them. So I had to relocate the worms, put them back into their original bin, and discontinue the experiment. But one of my upcoming videos that I've already done is going to be discussing that, but I'm not sure what the answer is just yet. So you're going to have to watch that video and the updated video after that to find the answers, because I don't know. Right. So how do you get rid of potworms in your worm bin? Crazy child. Okay, so to get rid of potworms in your worm bins, you have to get a slice of bread or several slices of bread, soak it in milk, cow's milk, and put it on the surface of your worm bin. The potworms love this, and so they will crawl on it to feed, and you just take the bread out with them on it, and you can either put them back outside in the soil or you can just kill them if you want to. Potworms are good composters, but you don't want too much of them in your worm bin. Yes, potworms. There are some tiny bins, tiny worms, tiny white worms. They look like a piece of thread. Now, I'm going to be discussing how you can identify them pretty shortly. So, are they harmful to the bin? No. The truth is that every soil that you come across have potworms in them. But because they are so small, if they are not in large quantity, then you might not recognize that they are there. So potworm is in every soil. Whether you buy it at the store or not, it can have potworms or their eggs in there. Because they're so tiny, even if the eggs are there, you will not see their eggs. They're not harmful. But I'm going to be telling you a bit about why you don't want them in your worm bin. What is indicated by a lot of potworms in your bin? If your bin is acidic, then that is going to cause an explosion of potworms because they like the acidic conditions, whereas the regular composting worms don't like acidic environment. So if you see a lot of potworms, it means that your bin is too acidic. Also, if your bin is overly moist, then you're going to see an increase in the potworm population as well. So the bread soaking milk or allowing your worm bin to dry out to an extent, not to the extent where your worms are going to be in danger, but because the potworms are so small, they are more likely to die off faster than your composting worms. So your potworms are going to die off faster than your composting worms. And so for that reason, you can allow your worm bin to dry out to an extent. Now, how can you identify potworms? As I mentioned before, they are tiny, white, thread-like. They always are white. Your hatchlings usually are tiny and white as well, but they are thicker in body size except for the first 8 hours of birth. And the good thing is that your hatchlings, within 8 hours of birth, will start to get their red pigmentation. So within that period of time, after 8 hours, then you can identify them different from your potworms. Potworms are usually half to 3/4 of an inch in length. They don't go over 3/4 of an inch in length. So if you see a large population of white worms and they're all on the same size, then you have a good indicator that yes, these are potworms and not composting worms. Potworms are good composting worms too, but you know that once you have them, a lot of them in your bin is too acidic or too wet. So then you don't want to have them in your bin. And if your bin is too acidic, then what you have to do is use the diatomaceous earth, eggshell, and aerate your bin in order to reduce the acidity. Uh, if your bin is too acidic, also you can take out some of the food scraps, or you can restart your bin or aerate your bin. Now, how can you know if your bin is acidic One, you're going to smell your bin. It's going to be sour. If your bin is sour, any at all, it means that your bin is acidic. If your bin is slimy, good question, or healthy home. I will get back to that shortly. If your bin is slimy, then it means that your bin is acidic because it is not getting enough air supply. Then your bin becomes anaerobic. Once your bin becomes anaerobic, it will become acidic. You can also tell if your bin is acidic if your worms are trying to escape. Of course, there are many reasons why your worms will try to escape, but if your bin is acidic, your worms will try to escape as well. You can also use a tester, a pH tester, to find out if your bin is acidic. But usually you don't have to get a pH tester just to find out if your bin is acidic. If you have a combination of foul smell in your bin, worms are trying to escape, or your material is slimy, then you know right off the bat your bin is acidic. So what can cause your, before I ask this question, let's answer our Healthy Homes question. How do worms reproduce? Close to the head of your worms, there is a little white ring on all around the worm, close to its head. This is called a clitellum. Now, worms are what you called, what's the term? Hermaphrodites? That's the term you use when one creature has both sex, right? Yes. So worms can either be male or female, and they can actually change their sex. So if the need is for them for more males, then they will change their sex to male. If there is need for female, then they will change their sex to female. So they can change their sex at any point in time. So worms reproduce by joining their clitellum together, and they usually stay in this position. You will see them look as if they're tied. And then within 2 hours, they will separate. Liquid, what's that liquid called again? I don't remember what that liquid is called, but anyway, the yes, so the liquid that they produce in their clitellum will combine with each other, and the egg will start to form. Now, the research that I did on this was 3 years ago, so I don't remember everything about the whole process of how that works, but yes, it is by joining their clitellums together that they are able to reproduce. I don't remember how long after they have joined that the eggs form and they lay their eggs. Albuminous fluid. The name that I saw for it was a different one. Oh, hi, Indiana. How are you? Welcome to my live. We're discussing worm farming, question and answer. So if you have questions on worm farming, feel free. Feel free to ask your questions, and I will answer whichever one I can. And yes, so we're discussing quite a few things about worms, how to start your worm bin, the type of insects that can be found in your worm bin, whether or not they're harmful or not. And the things like those, how you can identify potworms, and how you can tell if your bin is acidic. Now, I think I have exhausted all of the questions that I wrote down for today. Right. So what do you do though if you don't want to have a worm farm? Just simply throw your food scraps in your garden. The worms will come in and eat and drop their dung, and you're good to go. You don't have to take care of any worms. Very nice, very simple. and you get the benefits from it. So let's see. How long have you had a worm farm? I started my worm farm about 3 years ago. And the funny thing is that I didn't know anything about worm farming. I didn't even know that people raise worms. I just know that the worms were good in your garden and that if you have organic matter, then you will see more worms. But I didn't know about worm farming on a whole. I was researching composting because I had a few compost bin and I wanted to learn the best way or the fastest way to compost, what I need to have in my compost and stuff like that. So in the process of researching compost, then I started noticing terms coming up like vermicomposting and stuff. So that is how I got my start in worm farming. Do you ship red wigglers to US? Yes, I can ship red wigglers to the US. Um, However, the cost of the worms is fixed, but delivery charge is whatever the post office will charge me for shipping it to you, then that charge will be transferred to you. I won't add anything extra to it. So just the cost, whatever the post office charge for shipping, and the cost of my worms. How do, sorry, how the eggs, how long does the eggs take to hatch? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, worm eggs, it is said that they can take 2 to 5 weeks to hatch. So it depends on the condition that the eggs are in at the point in time. So the truth of the matter is that your worm eggs can take up to 3 years to hatch, which is good, and it can be bad. Worm eggs will hatch quickly if, I don't know how they're able to tell this, but if there is food supply, if the moisture content around them, if the temperature around them is ideal and they have enough food scraps, the worm eggs will hatch quickly within 2 to 3 weeks in general. And on the longer side, it will take up to 5 weeks. If, however, the conditions are not right, so the food scrap is not there, the bin is acidic, the moisture content is not there, and stuff like that, your worm eggs can lay dormant for 3 years. After that, it will die. But for 3 years, your worm eggs can lay dormant without hatching until the conditions increase. Okay, I can do that. At the end of my videos, you usually, well, not necessarily my live, but at the end of my videos in general, my email is always there. So I can put it to the live as well. Why are you looking at me? It's my business email. I have to use it. Yes. I would like to find out the cost. I will send you my zip code. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, about
Right.
shipping. Like the time it takes.
I don't know the time that it takes for shipping. It depends on what the customer wants. If the customer wants me to ship and they want a fast delivery, then
Well, they say it's worms.
then they are going to cover the cost of the fast delivery. How deep does the worm bin have to be? That's a very good question. Your worm bin is dependent on you. To an extent, if you're raising things like the night crawlers, whether European, Canadian, or African night crawlers, then your bin need to be deep. So a deep towards say 15, 20 inches is good because they live down in the lower part of the bin and then they feed. They might come up and feed, or they might feed throughout the entire bin, but they like a lot of space and they like to be able to go deep. So if you're raising any of the night crawlers, then you want a deeper bin. If, however, you're raising the red wigglers, it does not have to be deep. It can be 6 inches. It can even be 4 inches. It doesn't matter. The most important thing with your composting worms is the surface area of your bin. So the top surface of your bin for your worms, if you have 1 pound of worms, you need to have a surface area of 1 square foot. Some people might have 2 pounds of worms to 1 square foot, and they find that to be okay. But in general, the rule of the thumb is that you have 1 square foot of surface area per pound of worms. If your worm bin becomes overcrowded, the adult worms will leave the bin in order to give the younger worms space so that they can survive. So you want to make sure that you have 1 square foot per pound of worms. Now, if you're going to have food scraps and bedding throughout the entire bin all at once, then your worms, it doesn't really matter that much if you have 1 square foot per pound of worms, because the worms are going to be moving throughout the material. But if you are going to be feeding a small amount to your worms incrementally, then you need to have that 1 square foot of surface area per pound of worm. Okay. Right. So I'm just gonna tell you of a little experience I had with my worms when I first started out, and the effect that it had on my worms. When I first started my worm bin, I bought a pound of worms and I put it in my compost bin because I didn't have a worm bin. I wasn't thinking of raising them indoors or anything like that. I was just thinking about, I have a compost bin and I'm going to put them in there. My compost bin at the time was 4 by 4 feet by 4 feet high, and the bin was about 2/3 with compost, some of it partially composted, some of it was fresh material. I put a pound of worm in there. Within 2.5 months, I had 20 pounds of worm from that 1 pound of worm. My worms have never reproduced that much ever again, but that was the experience that I had the first time I had my worms. Now, I did not know that the square footage, the surface area matters, or the amount of worm that you have per square foot of surface area matters. So I got two totes that were 18 by 15 by 2 feet long. And I put divide the worms in two. And so I had 10 pounds in that bin and I had 10 pounds in the other bin. Now, this is only 2.5 square foot of surface area per bin with 10 pounds of worms. My worms crawled out over the winter. They were in my basement and I would just go and every now and then you would see worms on the ground. I lost 16 pounds of worms because I had too many worms in that bin. So it is very important that you pay attention to the amount of worms and the surface area of your bin. Hi, Loves Nature. How are you? Welcome to my live. Let's see. Is the odd worm with protein poisoning something to be concerned with? Seems only older worms affected, other worms are thriving. That is an interesting question. I've never really heard of worms having protein poison before. What are you feeding your worms? Okay, in the meantime, Indiana says, I think maybe the more space they have, the more they reproduce. Yes, that is the experience that I have. And so I decided to put it to the test this year. And so I put about 3 pounds of worms. Most of them were hatchlings in my compost bin outside the same 4x4 bin. And the worm shelving that I have now with the 40 bins, all of the worms, well, that's not true. I think 16 of those bins came from somewhere else. The worms came from somewhere else, so that would leave me with 24. 24 of those bins that I have now are worms that came from that 3 pounds of worm that I had in the 4x4 bin. So once worms recognize that they have a lot of food, they have a lot of space, they have a lot of air supply and moisture, they will just reproduce because there's no reason not to. They have everything they need there. And so they will just keep reproducing. So it is a good idea to give your worms space. And as I mentioned, that one of my worm shelving has 40 bins. It's not that I have that many worms, but it is that by spreading them over the 40 bin, I am giving them space so that they can reproduce faster, because the faster they reproduce, then the more castings I'm going to have.
Okay, so back to who was it who asked about protein? Loves Nature.
Yeah.
So basically, it is a balanced diet. I just did some light research on it. It says that as you add food to your warm bin, particularly with food that are high in protein, you must add enough calcium-rich buffers to the bedding to neutralize acid produced by protein-rich foods. So basically, it's just you need to add more calcium to your garden if you're adding a lot of protein-based things. Because what will happen is that their intestines will rupture. I don't think I'm going to hear about that.
Okay, thank you for that point. Okay. Now, as she mentioned, had more calcium. Now, where can you get sources of calcium for your worm bin? Diatomaceous earth, lime, and lime is not, I'm not talking about the fruit lime, I'm talking about the calcium carbonate lime, or eggshell. These are excellent sources of calcium that you can add to your worm bin. Our Healthy Home asks, how did you weigh your worms? Well, I use 2 methods to weigh my worm. I have a little scale that I use, but then I have a container that holds exactly 1 pound. And so I will just fill that container, and then I know that, yes, this is a pound of worm. So pretty much that is how I weigh my worm. I either use the scale or I just put the worms in that container that holds a pound. Does the material of the bin makes a difference? I am not sure if I fully understand that question. Does the material of the bin make a difference? Are you talking about the bedding, or are you talking about what you feed to the worms? It's like the lies, you guys. Okay. You actually have to take them all out of the dirt. Okay. When you ask about taking them out of the dirt, Healthy Home, I am not sure I understand the question there. Are you asking when you're starting the worm bin, if you're taking worms from the soil? Or are you talking about the finished material, the finished casting, if you have to take the worms out? Now, if you're talking about the finished castings, if you take them out to weigh them, yes, you don't want to be weighing the soil. You want to know the worms. Of course, you cannot get every teeny bit of the soil out of the worms or off the worms, because worm have this slimy mucus on their skin that they use to protect them once you touch them. And so this mucus will cause some soil to stick to their bodies. So you have to take them out of the soil, and you have to get off as much of the soil as you can. and then you weigh them. And this is why when I'm selling my worms, because you cannot really get them 100% clean unless you're going to dip them in water and take them out, in which case if there are hatchlings in there, you won't be able to get the hatchlings out of the water. So I don't use that method. So this is why when I'm selling my worms, I usually had more worms than a pound, because there's going to be a bit of soil that you cannot get off the worms. Let's see, I think I'm missing something here. How long does it take 1 pound of worm to reproduce? Okay, that's a very good question, Indiana. Now, how do you get a pound of worm to reproduce? How it is said that a pound of worm can double in amount within 3 months. So it takes usually about 2 to 3 weeks for the worms to lay their eggs. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the eggs to hatch. It can take up to 5 weeks for the eggs to hatch. It takes 3 months for worms to reach maturity. So it takes 3 months for worm to double in population. Now, what we call a worm egg is actually a worm cocoon and not the worm egg. Now, one worm cocoon may have up to 20 eggs in it. So those tiny little eggs that we see, or the cocoon that we see, that's cocoon and not the eggs. The eggs are inside of that, which is why it can last 3 years without hatching, because that cocoon protects the eggs. Now, you can get up to, although they say worms will double in population within 3 months, the fact is, based on the amount of hatchlings that you can get from one cocoon, you can get up to 28 cocoons from 28 hatchlings from one egg. But that is very rare. Most times it is between 1 and 5 that you will get from it. So within 3 months, you can double your population, or you can have 28 times the amount of worms that you started with. Let's see, I know I'm missing a question here. Does the material in the bin differ? Oh, the material of the bin, metal or plastic? Metal and plastic, I think out of all the worm bins, plastic are good, better than metal, because metal tends to want to rust. It gets very hot. The plastic does get hot if it is in the sun, but the metal will get hotter. Worms do not like temperatures over 25 degrees Celsius. So the best temperature for your worms is between 10 degrees Celsius and 25 degrees Celsius. So metals, for that reason, is not the best thing for them. They can do well in there, but you have to make sure that your bin is well aerated. If you're going to be using metal, you have to make sure that you keep it in an environment where it can be cool, because the heat that the metal produces can kill your worms, and it does not take long for it to kill them either. Plastic can eat up as well, but it is not as bad. Is there a device to measure soil condition to prevent unhealthy conditions? May purchase a pH tester. Yes, I wish I had mine. I could show you. I have a tester that they call 3-in-1. There are several companies that make these. So to give you a brand, I don't even know the name of the one I am using, but they call it 3-in-1. Excuse me. No, there are different types of 3-in-1 tester. So you want to have one that is going to test moisture, acidity, and some of them test light. The one that I have tests light, but I'm not necessarily interested in testing light. The moisture content and the acidity, that is what I am interested in. So that is what if I'm going to be testing my soil, then that is what you want, the pH tester, and you want the moisture. So they have a lot of 3-in-1. You can go online and look for it. I bought mine last year summer, and I paid something like $8 something for it before taxes. So it is not really expensive. I don't know how good the quality is. I've used it maybe twice because I don't really need it. The moisture content in your bin, you can test it without using fancy device. The acidity in your bin, as I mentioned earlier, you can know the acidity in your bin if your bin is sour, if it smells sour, if the bin becomes slimy, or what was the next one? Yes, so if your bin is sour, slimy, and you see a lot of worm escaping. Worms escape for many reasons, so that might be just one of the reasons why your worm escape. But if your bin smells sour any at all, it is acidic. If your bin is slimy any at all, it is acidic. So you don't necessarily have to have a tester for this. Your bin is acidic, diatomaceous earth, calcium carbonate, or crushed eggshell. These will help to reduce the acidity. If your bin has too much moisture in there, that can also make your bin acidic, because a lot of moisture in your bin is going to restrict your airflow. If you don't have proper airflow, your bin is going to become anaerobic, and that can make your bin acidic as well. So you can just aerate your bin from time to time, and that will help with controlling the acidity in your bin. If you overfeed your bin, and by overfeeding, I mean you're giving your worms more food than they can eat within a particular period of time, then the food is going to break down and start to get sour. So that will make your bin acidic as well. So what I recommend is that you observe your worms. So say you have a pound of worms. They say that worms can eat half to their full body weight in a day. Most times, based on what I've seen, sometimes they can eat less than half their body weight, or their half their body weight in a day. So study your worms. Look at the rate at which they feed, because some worms are going to feed faster than others. Experiment with them. If a pound of worm eats, say, quarter pound of food in a day, then you know that is the rate at which they eat. You're going to feed them accordingly. If, however, you find that they're eating their body weight in a day, then you're going to feed them their body weight in a day. That is going to help to control how much food you put in your bin. You can feed your worms so that the food lasts for 3 days. I wouldn't recommend that you feed them for it to last longer than that if your worms eat slowly, because it will make your bin anaerobic. Now, if you're feeding your worms things like cornmeal, oats, finished compost, and stuff like that, then it doesn't really matter how much you put in there. But if you're feeding them food scraps, then that is where you're going to have a problem if you overfeed your worms. So you have to be careful of overfeeding them for that reason. Now, for the moisture content in your bin, you can test your moisture content. And one of the videos that I'm going to be putting up this week is going to be discussing that. I'm going to be showing you how to test the moisture content in your bin. So the rule of the thumb is that your bin must have enough moisture in it where it feels like a wrung out sponge. So when you take up the content of your bin and you squeeze it like this, you want to see maybe 1 or 2 drops coming out between your fingers. If you see water flowing, then your bin has way too much moisture. You just need to see 1 or 2 drops of moisture, and then you know that, yes, this is the right content, water content for your bin. Now, there are people who keep their bin a bit moist, but a bit on the drier side. So when they squeeze, you won't see any droplets, but at the same time, the material is still damp. This is good, but it can be bad for 2 reasons. One, if you don't get the chance to reach to your worm, to look after your worm, say you're out of town for a week and you don't get to look after your worms, then your bin can dry out quickly and your worms could be in danger. So it is good to have that moisture content where you at least see a few droplets. That way, even if you take long to get to your worms, you still have a buffer time so that it doesn't dry out fully. So another reason is that when you keep your bin a bit on the drier side, the size of your worm is going to be different. Worms breathe through their skin and they need moisture in order to breathe. If they don't have enough moisture, they will die. If they have just enough moisture to keep them alive, but not necessarily the right amount of moisture, then your worms are going to be alive. They're going to be feeding, but they're going to be skinny little worms. So you want to make sure that you have the right moisture content. So again, take a portion of the material that you have in your worm bin, squeeze it. You want to see just a few drops. Water should not be running. If when you squeeze you see water running, then shredded newspaper and shredded cardboard, get those, mix it into your bin. It will absorb some of the moisture. They sell soil tester strips on Amazon. Yes, they certainly do. Oh, that computer crashed earlier. It just shut down, so I had to switch to this. All right, back to school. Okay. Let's see. I purchased 24 reds. 90 days later, I have 700. Ooh, that's nice. That's a very, very nice increase. Way to go. Yes, they can. Once the condition is nice, your worm population will explode. So nice going, loves nature. So now you have to take very good care of those worms because you want to see that growth, that fast increase all the time. For instant aluminum foil punch. I'm not sure what that is about that aluminum foil pan. Would you suggest Tums for calcium? Crushed Tums in the bin? Just a thought. I know Tums is calcium. Yeah, I know that Tums is calcium, but I don't know if it is chemical based or if it is organic. I don't want to feed my worm anything that could be chemical based. So I'd have to be careful with that. I don't know, even if it is organic, what is it? What other additives do they have in there? Is it something that the worms would like? That I don't know. And so I would not necessarily use it, but maybe you can do a test on that. You know, put it in the bin and see what happens. Just not in the bin. Don't put it in your bin just in case. But maybe you could get a small container, a few worms and some bedding and food scraps, and then you put the thumbs in there and see what happens to it. That way, if something goes wrong, then all of your worms are not affected by it. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes, so I have covered all the points that I intended to discuss. Eggshells could be used for calcium instead. Yes, that is one of the things. In fact, that is my go-to whenever I need calcium in my worm bin. Oh, and now that you mentioned that, our healthy home, worms don't have teeth; they have gizzard, just like the chicken. So they can't chew the food. In fact, worms don't eat the food that you put in the bin. They feed on the bacteria that grows on the food. So you want worms to eat faster. You want to help them to digest their food. Then you can put small sand grits in there in the worm bin, or you can put crushed eggshell. Make sure it is crushed. And you can also use diatomaceous earth as well. These things will help the worms to digest the food faster. Coffee grounds is a very good idea. Very good point, Indiana. So when I feed my bin, I try to mix in the crushed eggshell. I don't wait until the bin become acidic. I don't wait because it's not just there for the acidity, it's also there to help the worms to digest their food. So what I usually do is save up my eggshells. I crush them as finely as I can and keep them in container. But before I do that, because eggshells can breathe bacteria so quickly, then I either wash my eggshell or I put it in the microwave and heat it up to kill the bacteria that is on it, crush it and store it so that I can have it ready whenever I want it to use. It appears I have done everything right. I will continue to closely monitor my reds and euros for protein poisoning. Do you recommend pulverizing eggshell or crush? The finer, the better. So, yes, so if you can pulverize it, then by all means, go ahead and pulverize it, because the finer it is, the better it is, the quicker it works, especially in neutralizing the acidity in your bin. Let's see, am I missing anything? The worms actually benefit from the grits in the shells. Yes. Eggshells. Yes, 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 yes. Crushed. Would you suggest? Okay, that's the same one I went through already. Okay, so if no one has any more questions, then I'm going to be shutting down. Just a friendly reminder that if you're going to be supporting each other on this that are on this live, then please do not leave a spamming comment like "I joined you, new friend here, I sub to you, your turn." Yes, because things like these are viewed as spam on YouTube, and if you do that, then YouTube is going to take your subscription away. So don't leave any form of spamming comment. Okay, Han White, thank you for your time. And what other point did I want to make? Yes, so another point is that on Fridays, I'm going to be having my live. It is going to be somewhere between 9 and 12 o'clock on Fridays. And I'm going to be dedicating this day to discussing worm farming. Then on Mondays or whichever other day I may do live, preferably Monday, then I'm not sure about what time frame I'm going to be having that, but that one is going to be dedicated to whatever topic you want to discuss. So whether it is gardening or whatever, but because there are so many persons interested in worm farming and there are so many questions about worm farming, so I'm going to be dedicating Friday mornings to discussing whatever questions you may have about worm farming. So stay tuned for that. Do coffee grounds work as grit? Yes, coffee grounds do work as grit. You have to be careful of how much coffee grounds you use in your worm bin, however, because as you may know, coffee is very high in nitrogen. Nitrogen produces heat, and so it can affect your worms negatively if there is too much in there. Coffee grounds can also become a bit on the acidic side as well. So you have to be careful of how much coffee grounds you give your worms at any particular time. Okay, that is it. I will just hang around for a minute or two so that if you want to get the names of those who are on this live so that you can join them or at least check out their channel, then you can do so. Now, another point, friendly reminder, if you check out someone's channel and you realize that you don't really like what they have on their channel, please don't subscribe to them with the hope that they subscribe back to you. because if you do that, you're not going to stay long because you're not interested in the content that they have on their channel. So only if you're really genuinely interested in watching their channel, then you should subscribe to them, because you're going to mess with their algorithm if you do that, and you don't want them to mess with yours. So don't do that to others. I hope you guys have a lovely day. Love your channel. Oh, thank you, Loves Nature. Thank you all for joining me, and I hope you have yourself a wonderful day.